Hello everyone, this is Dr. Vishal Kewali from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada. And today it's my big pleasure and honor to be speaking at this meeting about early phase cancer clinical trials and should they be a priority for low and middle income countries. These are my disclosures. Cancer has become a significant public health problem across the world. Cancer is no longer a disease of the global north alone. Low and middle income countries have significant disease burden from cancer. However, if we look at the treatment guidelines for treating cancer and other non-communicable diseases, we find that most of the evidence come from trials that were not run in low and middle income countries. This interesting paper looked at the Cochrane reviews and looked at the clinical trials that were included in these Cochrane reviews and found that very small percentage, only 13% of the total trials came from low income countries, and only 982 participants, that's just like one trial, were from low income countries. So low and middle income countries, they cannot afford to not make cancer control their priority policy agenda. And policy is effective only when it is driven by data, and data comes from research and trials. Therefore, clinical research and clinical trials should be the priorities for low and middle income countries. But that's not the question today that we're going to answer. We need to answer the question, are early phase clinical trials a priority for low and middle income countries? Yes, research and trials are, but are early phase trials a priority? So I try to look at the different arguments that people make both for and against conducting early phase clinical trials in low and middle income countries. Let's look at these arguments one by one and let's examine the merit of those arguments. First, the first important argument for why early phase clinical trials should run in low and middle income countries is that it's a discrimination not to. Like, why should not? Why should not low and middle income countries participate in early phase clinical trials? It's a discrimination against those countries, against the patients in those countries, for not to run these clinical trials in low and middle income countries simply because they are low and middle income country. So that's the first argument about discrimination. In this very interesting paper, the authors argue that the reasons why these first-in-human trials or early clinical trials were not conducted in low and middle-income countries in the past, they no longer hold true. And especially for conditions that are prevalent in low and middle-income countries, these early phase clinical trials should be performed in low and middle-income countries. But of course, we should provide other adequate protections to the participants. But yes, the low and middle income countries should be participating in early phase clinical trials. They make a very good argument in this paper. The other argument for doing early phase clinical trials in LMICs is that it provides an opportunity for capacity building, training opportunity for collaboration. That's how low and middle income countries will learn, and it will be an opportunity to build capacity to run other clinical research in the past as a result of that training opportunity they got while conducting early phase clinical trials. The other argument is about access to novel drugs. These early phase clinical trials are testing newer agents. So patients in high income countries will have access to these new agents because they were a part of those early phase clinical trials, and we keep hearing those stories about the first person who got Icotinib, the first person who got CAR T cell therapy. All of those stories come from high income countries because patients in low income countries, they will not have access to these drugs because the early phase trials were not run in those parts of the world. The other argument actually is that there might be some niche pockets of population in low and middle income countries that is unique to that country, unique to that community, and it may not be possible to run such a trial elsewhere. It might be possible to run such a trial only in that particular country or those countries, or it may be easier to run those trials in those populations, because elsewhere it would be a rare cancer, but in a given particular country it might be common cancer. One example from the recent ASCO meeting was the Jupiter-02 trial of a new checkpoint inhibitor for metastatic nasopharyngeal carcinoma. This trial was conducted in China, although this is a randomized trial, but this makes the point because nasopharyngeal carcinoma is an uncommon cancer in rest of the world, in the Western world. But this is a common cancer in China. So this running such a trial will meet both the purpose. One is that it will give us evidence to treat nasopharyngeal carcinoma all over the world, but a trial could not have been run in rest of the world. But it also caters to the local need, because now we have a treatment that is important for local patient population. That is also an argument for addressing the local priorities, because there are unique priorities of low and middle income countries that need unique drugs or unique combination of drugs, keeping financial toxicity in mind. So they need to be thinking about cost-effective interventions. And these priorities that are unique to low and middle income countries may not align with the priorities of the Western world. This was an interesting paper about gynecological cancers, in which the investigators doing trials in low and middle income countries, they review about several challenges and opportunities for running clinical trials in LMICs, and they correctly identify that the priorities for low and middle income countries are quite different for capacity building and for running clinical trials. For example, in LMICs, palliative care, hypofractionation, de-escalation of treatment, they were higher priorities, which are not a priority for high-income countries. So low and middle income countries need to identify the priorities and to come up with cost-effective solutions catered to the local need. For example, in China, they locally manufactured what we would call a Me Too version of an EGFR TKI for non-small cell lung cancer. It's called Icotinib. And this was after erlotinib and gefitinib were already in the market. So running a clinical trial of Icotinib outside of China would not have been possible, but it was a local need. Erlotinib and gefitinib have substantial financial toxicities, so they ran a phase 1 early phase clinical trials and then ran a bigger trial of Icotinib, and it was priced quite low compared to the standard of care erlotinib and gefitinib, and actually that led to substantial reduction in the prices. As you can see from this graph, Icotinib started to have more and more market share, and gefitinib and erlotinib prices ultimately dropped to match to that of Icotinib price. And the other final argument for running early phase clinical trials, or any clinical trial for that matter, in LMICs is the low cost of trials and less regulatory bureaucracy in LMICs compared to increased complexity of running trials and cost of running trials in high-income countries. Now let's talk about the arguments against conducting early phase clinical trials in LMICs. Why LMICs should not be involved or should not run early phase clinical trials. And the first argument is that there is a lot of predatory practice in global health research. There are issues related to patient protection and ethical issues of running clinical trials in LMICs, especially early phase clinical trials. Let's try to explore this topic in a little more detail. This was a nice paper published in New England Journal of Medicine many years ago now, in which they point out various ethical and scientific implications of running clinical trials in low and middle income countries. Of course, there are disparities between patient characteristics in high-income countries and lower middle-income countries in terms of educational status, economic and social status, and access to healthcare. Therefore, the patients in lower middle-income countries may not necessarily understand the implications of participating in a clinical research. They may not understand the nuances of participation in the clinical research or the experimental age, and they lack they might lack the understanding about the drug, and also because access to healthcare is not uniform and affordable, participation in the trial may be the only way some of these patients might have any access to healthcare at all. So although the participation in trial is called voluntary, for all practical purposes, it may be mandatory because it will not be an option between regular healthcare versus trial, but it would be an option between any healthcare as a part of the trial versus no healthcare. And in fact, in some cases, the financial compensation for participating in the trial may even exceed the annual wages of people living in low and middle income countries, and that might be a big incentive for the patients to get enrolled into the clinical trial. And not only patients, sometimes even the physicians, they will have to make that ethical decision between the patients not affording any treatment at all versus patients affording at least some treatment as a part of the trial, and also receiving financial compensation. And the other important issue that has become more and more important in recent days is the issue of ethically problematic studies with interventions that would be deemed ethically unacceptable in the Western world, but the trial may be able to recruit patients in low and middle income countries because of all those other incentives. This editorial, when it was published in the Lancet Global Health, made some big splash because it talked about predatory practices in global health research, specifically about research parachutes and research parasites. Research parachute is when an investigator from high-income country goes to a low and middle-income country, collects data, does research, and comes back to high-income country and publishes a paper without having any co-authors from low and middle-income countries. But I think the concept goes broader, more than just authorship. We see these parachute practices across global health research, including global oncology, in which, for example, we are running a clinical trial in low and middle income countries with an experimental agent. The trial is successful and the agent is approved in high income countries, but the patients in low and middle income countries will never have access to that drug again. The Cemiplimab trial is an example. We know that pembrolizumab is the standard of care for PD-L1 positive non-small cell lung cancer patients. From the trial in 2016, the trial was published in 2016 November, and pembrolizumab has become the standard of care for these patients. However, the Cemiplimab trial ran from 2017 to 2020 and enrolled patients to be randomized to Cemiplimab or chemotherapy, when in fact in 2016 we already knew chemotherapy was inferior to pembrolizumab, and these patients would get pembrolizumab if they were not a part of this trial and if they had no problem with access. But they argued that this trial was run in different low and middle income countries across the world, and these patients would not have access to any checkpoint inhibitor if they were not a part of the trial. But if we look at the trial population, these are 356 patients who got Cemiplimab across these many countries, where the total cancer patient population must be several thousands. So only 356 patients getting access to a checkpoint inhibitor among thousands of patients in these countries. Does it justify running the trial in low and middle income countries when there is no guaranteed access to this drug after the trial is complete? And in fact, this trial was positive and it led to FDA approval of this drug, but many patients in all these countries where the trial was run do not have any access to this drug. So this access to the new drug for a few patients in the trial, can it justify conducting a trial that would not have been considered ethical in high-income countries? This is not just for the randomized trial. This is important for early phase clinical trials as well, because if we are running an early phase clinical trial in a low and middle income country and the participants do not have a chance of having access to that drug when the drug is ultimately proven to be successful, or even phase 3 trials are run in different countries and not run in that country where phase 1 trial is conducted, then that's an ethical issue. And we need to keep in mind that Helsinki Declaration actually says that the patient should be getting best standard of care and not just local standard of care. And without the guarantee for continued access, that becomes an ethical challenge. This question was answered in a very interesting recent paper published in JAMA Open. They looked at the drugs that were approved by the US FDA, but the trials were run outside of the USA, and what percent of the countries continued to have access to that drug after it was approved. So within 1 year, the high-income countries outside of the USA, 13% of them had access to the drug after it got approved from the US FDA, but 0% of the countries that participated in the pivotal trials had access to these drugs. Within 5 years, it looks a little better, but not good. 46% of the high-income countries had, but only 9% of the upper middle income and 22% of the lower middle income countries that participated in these pivotal trials had continued access to the same drug. If we look in terms of geography, we can see that 0% of countries from the Middle East and Africa, they had access to these drugs that led to FDA approval, although they participated in those trials until 3 years after approval. The other argument against early phase clinical trial in LMICs is that LMICs have other priorities. If you have resources, why not conduct randomized trials instead of conducting early phase clinical trials? Because randomized trials actually change practice. There have been several important seminal randomized trials that came from low and middle income countries that are immediately practice changing. So if you have resources, why not do these instead of running early phase clinical trials? And next is a counter argument to the access to novel drugs hypothesis, because since these are early phase clinical trials, there is low likelihood of these drugs being ultimately successful. So if these drugs are not ultimately successful, then access to these unsuccessful cancer drugs is not that big a deal. And we have also shown that even when these drugs or trials are successful, very few patients in LMICs continue to have access to these drugs anyway. The other counter argument is that the early phase clinical trials are run only in specialized centers, even in high-income countries. They require special expertise, special facilities. There are issues with quality control. So these are the trials that are not run at every center in high-income countries. So running them in low and middle-income countries will be much more challenging. For example, if we look at the number of phase 1 trials registered in outside of the US and Europe, we see that there are few, but we also see that if you look at the data in Africa and South America, very few trials are being registered. And if you look at South Asia, most of those trials, they are registered in one single country. And the other argument about low cost of trials and less regulatory bureaucracy, it may not always be true, because one example, again from the ASCO plenary, the OUTBACK trial of locally advanced cervical cancer. This is an important trial relevant for global oncology. Cervical cancer is a big disease burden. But if you look at this trial, only 1% of the patients came from outside of USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Only 1% of the patients came from outside of the developed countries or high-income countries. Why? They had explained the reasons in one other paper, in which they mentioned that the lack of research infrastructure, compliance with GCP, cost of treatment, and administrative approval, they can be quite onerous when you are trying to do trials in LMICs. But in this particular case, they gave the example of India. And India had GCP compliance and had research infrastructure, but still they could not open the trial in India because the government required that the sponsored country had to pay the cost of treatment, which was not practical for a non-industry sponsored trial. And similarly, they give examples of taking at least 2 years to open up another trial in Mexico due to the requirement for approvals. And I actually had the opportunity to talk to the principal investigator of the OUTBACK trial on Twitter, and she acknowledged that she really tried hard to open sites in India and South America, but despite enthusiastic local investigators, there were barriers, including lack of funding for academic trials and massive cost of clinical trial insurance. So there are different scientific and ethical arguments both for and against conducting early phase clinical trials in LMICs. And I think this is one of the best papers and very thoughtful paper that I have read on this topic. And they in fact provide a table of policy reports from several international and national committees. And this was interesting that most of these committees, they have a common point in the statement. If you look at the highlighted portions of these statements, almost all of these committees, are asking to ensure that the research is responsive to the health needs and priorities of the local community. If it's not a priority in the local community, you can't just do a parachute research for your gain using participants from LMICs. The community should benefit from that, and that intervention should be addressing a local priority need. So my overall conclusion would be that it is impossible to make a blanket statement about whether LMICs should make early phase clinical trials a priority agenda. I think it is definitely better to have good early phase trials than to have bad RCTs. But the main focus should be on how to do trials correctly, uh, and what investment is required for doing that, and is that a priority in a local setting, and can that be sustainable, and can that intervention be exercised in the long run even after the trial is over. So there is no point in LMICs doing a phase 1 trial of a cancer drug whose phase 3 will be run elsewhere, and the drug will be approved elsewhere and will continue to be unaffordable in the LMICs. Those sort of phase 1 trials should not be the priorities. And another fundamental question that should be asked is, would the resources be better spent elsewhere? Where are we taking the resources from in order to invest it in early phase trials? And that should be judged properly. But the bottom line is, doing trials just for the sake of doing trials, just to say that, oh, we are doing clinical trials, early phase trials, that should be avoided. The ultimate goal should always be kept in mind. Thank you very much. I'm deeply grateful to Professor Jonathan Kimmelman from McGill University and Professor Elizabeth Eisenhower and Professor Scott Berry from Queen's University for their thoughtful comments. Please feel free to ask me any questions you may have by email or Twitter.